Natural selection does not equal to evolution. We can see from nature that the characteristics of animals do change over time to help them to adapt better to the environment. This is known as natural selection. However, this does not mean that animals have evolved from one kind to an entirely different kind, as proposed by Charles Darwin. So, I will explain to you how natural selection is not the same as evolution. Firstly, some definitions. Adaptation is the process of changing something to suit a new environment or situation. In our context, adaptation is a characteristic that increases an animal's chances of surviving, mating, and reproducing. For example, finches on different islands in the Galapagos archipelago had adapted to having different beaks according to the food available on their respective island. The Galapagos finches are Darwin's famous examples of natural selection. Each Galapagos island had its own species of finch, all very closely related. Darwin noted that the finch's beak sizes and shapes were all adapted for the specific type of food that species ate, such as small seeds, large seeds, buds, food, or insects. This adaptation suggested that their beaks changed due to natural selection. Beak characteristics were essential to survival, and those individuals with the right shaped beak to reach the food would survive and pass that beak shape to its offspring. Natural selection is a process where animals with specific features survive better than the same kind of animal without them in an environment or under certain circumstances. The ones with those features survive better and increase in number, and those without them reduce in number or die. The ones that survive pass on their features to future generations. Natural selection is also called in simple terms survival of the fittest to reproduce. An example of natural selection are the peppered moths. In England, the peppered moth has two forms, a light and dark colored form. In the early 1800s, the lighter moths usually blended better into their surroundings, whereas the darker moths stood out on the light colored trees and were more quickly eaten. The light colored moths were therefore very common, and the dark color were rare. Because of the Industrial Revolution, many coal burning factories were built, thus causing pollution and soot to darken the trees. The dark moths now blended better into their surroundings, and they were now more likely to survive. By 1895, 95% of the peppered moths were dark colored. So, adaptation and natural selection sound almost similar, but adaptation is the characteristic that changes according to the environment, while natural selection is the mechanism that increases how likely beneficial features are passed to future generations. What is the general meaning of evolution? It is the slow, steady development of plants, animals, etc. during the history of the earth as they adapt to changes in their environment. Basically, evolution means change in a species over time. In this sense, evolution is just how animals, according to their kind, have adapted to the environment over time. However, those who support the theory of evolution are suggesting more than just adaptation. Evolutionists believe that all living things come from one or several common ancestors billions of years ago. As you can see in this picture, The tree of life shows the relationship among common groups of animals. This idea dates back to Anaximander of Miletus, a Greek philosopher who lived in the 500s BCE. Anaximander said all life forms come from fish, since man in infancy needs a long period of nurture and could not have survived if he had always been what he is now. Different philosophers and scientists suggested different points that would become part of the evolutionary theory. Some suggested that life began in a mixture of chemicals called the primordial soup that suddenly had a spark of life that changed the chemicals to become more and more complex life forms. But it only became a scientific theory when Charles Darwin, in his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and a scientific contemporary of his, Alfred Russel Wallace, proposed that evolution occurs because of natural selection or survival of the fittest. Darwin saw the adaptation of finches on Galapagos and applied those small-scale changes to the large-scale evolution of all life forms from a common ancestor. He said natural selection is the force behind evolution. Given enough time, he believed a simple organism could change into a higher life form. As beneficial adaptations accumulate over time, evolution occurs, and accumulated adaptations become so numerous. The new animal's DNA is no longer compatible with its ancestors' DNA, and so the organism has evolved into a new species. For those who believe in creation, natural selection is the mechanism that God used to allow animals to deal with their changing environments in a sin-cursed world, especially after the flood. God knew beforehand that the fall and the flood were going to happen, so he designed animals with a great amount of genetic diversity that could be selected for or against to produce certain characteristics depending on the circumstances. The genetic material which enables adaptation was already present in animals. God made each animal after its own kind. The great variety of information in the original created kinds can only be attributed to one intelligence, God. The Bible was written thousands of years before Carl Linnaeus created the system of classifying organisms into domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Therefore, the original Hebrew and Greek text did not include the word species. Genesis 1 records that God created creatures according to their min. This is the Hebrew word normally translated into English as kind. In Genesis 6, God commanded Noah to take male and female of each land-dwelling, air-breathing min on board the ark. Genesis 7 tells us why: to repopulate the world after the flood. These clues suggest that the min can be identified by breeding two individuals. If they successfully produce offspring, they are part of the same min. Our current understanding would be that min or kind is the level of family. For example, all cat species, from lions to house cats, belong to the same family. They are part of the same min. Since Noah took only one pair of cat min on board the ark, the 30 plus species of cats alive today have formed since the flood. How? Via adaptation, natural selection, and biological change. This is the modern creationist view. As you can see from these diagrams, the evolutionary tree shows that all species come from one common ancestor, which itself came from non-living chemicals. But the creationist orchard shows that diversity has happened within the original Genesis kinds. Natural selection may result in changes in an animal, but it merely filters or reduces pre-existing genetic information. Evolution requires a massive amount of new genetic information. For example, poodles bred by humans in a process called artificial selection cause the loss of genetic variety and all kinds of mutations, making poodles likely to have all kinds of problems like cancer, epilepsy, and glaucoma. Such mechanisms are often a downward process. A poodle is a much reduced version of its ancestor, the wolf. Natural selection certainly cannot add the new genetic information that would be required to change, say, a poodle to an elephant. That is why most evolutionists have moved on from the outdated concept of traditional Darwinism, natural selection plus millions of years, to a position of neo-Darwinism, which claims mutations add new information, which would make the word equation natural selection plus mutations plus millions of years. But mutations corrupt information or cause a loss of it, or at most remain neutral. Natural selection is not a creative process. It is a change within the already existing gene pool, rather than a directional, stair-step progression to different kinds. Natural selection is more like a merry-go-round of variation as the scenery changes. But when the carousel stops, you are still riding on the same kind of animal. Studies by Doctors Peter and Rosemary Grant over the past decades have shown that the beak size of the Galapagos finches changes with the climate of the islands they inhabit. Beaks got larger during droughts and smaller during wet periods. All the while, birds were observed to interbreed. Natural selection is actually a passive process, and the agent is death. In theory, an animal that is sickly, weak, or unsuited for a particular environment is less likely to survive. An animal with traits more suited for a particular environment is more likely to survive and thus pass on its better genetic makeup to its offspring. In reality, this doesn't happen so neatly. Maybe the diseased zebra survives long enough to pass its mutant genes onto its offspring, or the stronger rabbit just happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time and gets picked off by the owl. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 11 says, "Again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to them all." This is an example of how animals quickly adapt to their environment using genetic information. 5 pairs of adult lizards were moved from one Croatian island to another in 1971 in an experiment. When scientists returned to the island, it was swarming with lizards. Genetic tests confirmed that the modern population of lizards all descended from the original 10 lizards that were brought there. The descendants of the introduced lizards had, among other adaptations, what seemed to be a new gut structure. All of these changes took about 40 years. It was surprisingly quick compared to the long evolutionary timeline many scientists stick to. This did not involve new genetic information. The original lizards did have the ability to digest plant material. However, it just was not needed in their previous habitat, and they simply preferred insects for roughly 95% of their dietary needs. Since they were now transplanted to an island filled with plants, their gut structure adapted to one being more suitable for digesting plants. Most people think Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection in his book On the Origin of Species. Actually, he only popularized the idea. He actually borrowed the idea from several other people, especially creationist Edward Blyth. Blyth published several articles between 1835 and 1837. That is a full 22 years before Darwin published his book. Darwin also had copies of these magazines, and parts of his book were nearly word for word from Blyth's articles in the Magazine of Natural History. The difference between the two men's thoughts. Edward Blyth believed in God as the creator. Charles Darwin believed in the blind forces of nature. Blyth believed all species descended from the original animal kinds. Darwin believed animals came from microorganisms that evolved over the millions of years. Blyth believed natural selection acts by conserving. Darwin believed natural selection originates. Blyth believed man is a separate creation from animals. Darwin believed man came from monkeys. In short, animals and other organisms do go through adaptation and natural selection, but natural selection is unable to cause a molecule to man evolution. Thank you very much.